Hello and welcome to this week's Tech Talk Tuesday. Today we'll be talking about having a successful VoIP deployment. I know I've started a little early, so I'm going to give a few minutes for folks to come on by. Certainly you're all welcome. Tell a friend. If you missed tonight's or any night, check out our YouTube channel. The links are in the presentation. The slides are shared on SlideShare, and you can follow me on Facebook. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. So lots of ways to catch up and stay current. I really hope it's providing value. Feel free at any time to leave comments, and we'll do our best to tackle some of their questions in the future episodes. So let's get started on this topic, Tech Talk. My name is David Headley. I have 25 years in the IT industry and over 20 years working as a network engineer. I've been working a big chunk of the last 6 years on deploying Cisco VoIP across a number a large enterprise. That my functional role is infrastructure engineer, so I'm not designing ACD I'm not doing that piece of it. I'm building the foundation upon which a successful VoIP deployment is built. And I see a couple different scenarios where this talk really will make sense. Sometimes you're the network engineer, or you're sort of the network / systems engineer, and senior management has said, hey, we've just bought Cisco VoIP. We have consultants coming in, we're going to deploy this thing. Yeah, the consultants are only going to do so much. So there's some things you need to do to get ready to present it. You may be working in a large organization, and they're coming in with Cisco VoIP, and you're partnering. So you're a little more early. It's not so much a surprise, but you're still partnering and building a successful Cisco VoIP deployment. Now, I will tell you that it's not uncommon before we deployed Cisco, when I was actually looking at other systems, as I'd be just out in the world, I'd see a phone system and ask, it could be a travel agent, it could be Whole Foods, it could be anywhere. I'd say, hey, you've got a ShoreTel system, or you've got Cisco. How was it like? Did you hear when they switched into that phone system? And it was pretty universal that Cisco had the reputation of, about 6 months to get it right. I think a lot of that is just not doing the infrastructure right. So we're going to work to fix that. As a reminder, specific brands and models are for illustration purposes only. They do not imply any endorsement by the vendor in any way. I only include equipment that I have experience with. At the time of writing, I have not received any compensation or inducement from any vendor. I am a network infrastructure engineer, so I will not be speaking to planning HDQs, designing numbering plans, any of that piece of it. So if we're good with that, we're going to move on. Voice over IP, VoIP, okay. A category of hardware and software that enables people to use the internet as a transmission medium for telephone calls by sending voice data in packets using IP, Internet Protocol, rather than traditional circuit transmissions of the public switch telephone network. Came from Webopedia, thought it was a good enough definition. There we go. Now, if we go back to slide number 1, you notice my subtitle, well, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into. If you remember Laurel and Hardy, that was Oliver Hardy's line to Stan a lot was, well, Stanley, look at the mess you've got me into. And the reason I say that is all your eggs are in one basket. So it used to be, your network switch went down for a building or for a suite or a wing or whatever it was. They still have their phones. Now we've taken away everything with VoIP. So they have no wireless, they have no phones, they have no wired network, everything went down. So I think it makes the stakes a lot higher. Just a reminder about our triple constraints: time, quality or scope, money or budget. So I change any one of those, at least one other one has to change. If I want to crash a program and do it in half the time, it's going to either cost me more money or I have to do less. There's no two ways about it. Or I do it more cheaply. And a friend of mine said, I'm not rich enough to be cheap. That's a great line. If I want to come in cheaper, maybe I can spread the time out. That will allow me to do it for less money, or maybe I just don't do as much, and then I'm not going to spend as much, right? So this is really important. So the expectation, when you think about traditional phone systems, there was always dial tone. Always. You picked up a phone, you got dial tone, period. When you think about network, we don't say that. Like with wireless, we don't necessarily say, hey, you always get a connection on wireless. You might, well, it was kind of congested in this area, and there's a lot of ways we'll equivocate around some of these services. That's not true for voice. There's always dial tone. Calls are clear and intelligible always. Now, I gotta admit, that's in the last like 30 years. There was a time when we're used to like snap, crackle, and pop, and a lot of things when we were still doing a lot with a lot of physical wiring end to end around the globe. Right, we pick up a lot of artifacts in a call, but for the last decades, that hasn't been true of our hardwired phones. Right, you have some regulatory requirements to meet. Might be your enhanced 911 services, and of course, we want to set the expectation when you're deploying VoIP, you will not negatively impact the data network. So, great, you got this phone working great, and now everyone's madder than heck because their work is slowed down. That's not going to fly. So, those are some high expectations. Okay. So, as we get into scoping this project out, this is an important question. Are you defining the scope? Are you helping to define the scope? Are you just sort of given, this is what we're doing, make it happen, right? And of course, there's things like single campus, multiple campuses, because obviously, single campus, I probably don't have to worry about a WAN connection. I'm not taking any of this voice traffic across the WAN. All right. Am I going across WAN circuits, point to point? Are they VPN, MPLS? How am I interconnecting my various sites? Are you going to deploy wireless phones? So for Cisco, you have an option for wireless phones. I do think it's better to use a Cisco wireless phone than the other option is to deploy an analog voice gateway and use traditional cordless phones, because most of the cordless phones interfere with your wireless. So I'd rather have a wireless device that participates in the wireless network rather than a rogue, essentially, that is putting signal out into my spectrum and possibly interfering with my other wireless functions. Okay. And how will the eventual rollout be done? By departments, by sites, other? You may have an important piece as the infrastructure guy in helping decide that, what's actually going to be possible. You may, for example, have a number of sites that need extensive recabling work before you're ready to go. So that may be a reason to push out some sites versus others. Obviously, your telecom side is going to have a lot to say. If you have a number of sites that are all linked together on ACD queues, that splitting up ACD queues between different systems is not easy, is not straightforward. So that's probably, they're probably going to want to avoid that. Okay. So I think your first step, one of your most important steps as the infrastructure guy, is you taking inventory. And I'm doing this first. Now, this assumes one thing. This assumes I have some sort of monitoring tool, inventory tool that I already have set up that I have an inventory of all my equipment. So I'm going to use that. In the case I'm thinking of, we used HP Network Automation. That gave me a nice base, but I could have used SolarWinds. I could have used a lot of other tools that okay, here's everything that's in those locations. So I want to understand the locations. I want to understand what models of equipment I have, what their software versions are. I want my host names and management IPs, because of course I'm going to need to log back into these things. As much as possible, I'm going to want to understand if the devices are redundant. I want to do things like see if I have power budget for my PoE. So you're going to do things like show power on your devices. Do I have a sufficient overhead left over to support adding phones? And I'm going to need to do a little research as well I need to go into my data sheets and see how much power I can take. Hopefully, your consultant, your telecom guys haven't already bought a bunch of phones, and they say they're looking at 15 watt or 30 watt phones, and say you're still running with 3750 Gs, which they can't. They can run 24 ports at 15 watts. They can't run all of them. So you have a couple APs on there already. You start adding phones, it puts a limit on how many phones you can do. If you do the lower power phones, the 7 watt phones, well, you're even better. That you can have 48 ports, but you got to do the budget calculations. You had some APs, those are running at 15 watts. I may have some other PoE devices. I start taking away from my budget. Okay. There are some more qualitative things I want to make. So this is a spreadsheet I created. I'll have an example at some point posted. You want to track whether you've got your multicast configured, whether your quality of service policies are deployed. So if you already built all those pieces, you may not have, but certainly on my spreadsheet, I'm going to have columns for those because I'm going to want to track that I've actually done them. I want to track my circuit sizes. And certainly I want to use my tools, my SolarWinds, or if I have NetFlow or whatever it is I have that can give me a view into my WAN to see that if my circuits are already maxed out and I'm going to now add more traffic to it, I need to think about bandwidth upgrades. And I also want to double check, and this may be logging in devices and showing CDP neighbors to look and make sure that you've got all the devices you expect in your spreadsheet, and make sure those are on your monitoring. If you have multiple tools doing your monitoring, one of the newer tools that I know is live action. So you've got live action. Hey, are your WAN routers in your live action or not? You're going to want that because one of the things that's going to happen when you do this deployment is at some point or another, there's going to be complaints about quality and they're going to say it's the network. So you're going to want to have tools that are going to help you determine, am I having a lot of packet drops? Am I maxing out my circuit? What's going on? So you're going to want to check and make sure that's done first because it's going to be high stakes once you've already deployed to go back and then add it. Well, you have no baseline data before the deployment. You can't say, oh yeah, that circuit was already maxed out. Now you're in trouble and trying to backtrack. I also tracked telecom specific modules like the packet voice digital signal modules, PVDM, FXO, foreign exchange office, or foreign exchange subscriber FXX modules that were in my various routers. So I may not have before we started VoIP, we already had some of that stuff already in these routers. So I needed to track and just make sure I have the right components as we go forward, because that way, as I get requirements from my consultant, from my telecom team, I know what I already have. So okay, and do you qualify this when they say, hey, I want a PVDM and that you want to add one? Okay. And of course, track your power infrastructure, making sure you have your UPSs in monitoring as well. So if they're overloaded, you're going to get notification on it. You don't want to be surprised about it. If the batteries fail self-test, you're going to know about it. So I've done a spreadsheet. Now I'm going to go out and do a physical validation. So that's going to help me. It may help me find equipment that I missed. So wherever possible, travel to each and every site and look in every closet. I can't stress this too much. Is it physically clean? Is there garbage, dead systems, other items which need to be removed? And what's your largest contiguous number of rack units? So it may come back, they want to add, say, an analog voice gateway, like a VG350, which is 3Us. They may want to add an additional router for a voice gateway for the site. So they may be, I would say before, they were maybe deploying like the 3945 router, which is again 3Us, or a 3925 at 3U. So now I need at least 6Us. Maybe I don't have that. I don't have 2 3U spaces. Maybe I have to do some rearrangement. I'm going to want to do that before I try and deploy, so I can plan ahead. And of course, look at last week's talk about redundancy. Is there any single part which may cause an interruption in service? Make note of those so you can correct them. Maybe it's you don't have the coming off the router, you have all the links going to a single stack member in a stack. You want to fix that. And make sure everything is properly installed. this is another opportunity to look and see if there are two supervisors in the chassis. You certainly could have done that. When I was doing my spreadsheet, I would do a show mod and see that, yep, there's two supervisors. I can do show redundancy. Yes, they're properly redundant. And of course, I want to make sure they are, it's in standby hot and it's not in standby cold. So if I'm running RPR, that RPR mode, if there's a failure, is going to be a brief outage while the second supervisor finishes booting. I want to have that stateful failover. So that's the kind of thing I'm all checking out as I'm doing this look. I'm going to look at cable grades. Now, Cat 5e or better, I've got a spreadsheet I'll pull up. Let's make sure, good, we're still showing this one here. There's a lot of sites you can take a look at. So I actually physically looked at the cabling, a sampling of it at least, and made sure that I was Cat 5e or better, because most of these phones now are going to be gig or better. That Cat 5e is the minimum spec for gigabit. New sites I'm building Cat 6a, so technically I can go up to 10 gigs given the right equipment. So I feel pretty safe. So make sure you've got at least that 5e or better, and look carefully, because I had some sites I looked at. It was a mixture of 5 and 5e, so I saw differences in the color of cable. They were all blue, but there were different shades. Checked some of it out. That's 5, that's 5e, and there was no rhyme or reason. So I ended up having to recable whole closets, because I just trying to figure out what was 5 and 5e was going to cost me more than ripping the whole thing and starting over. So let's go back to our presentation. Oops. Sorry, kids. And of course, the other one is, did you split pairs? If you really have an old site, this is one of the things we did way back in the day. And that was, we would, for a 10 megabit port, even 100 megabit, I needed 2 pairs, but the cable had 4 pairs. So you take one cable to a station, split 2 pairs to each jack, and I can have 2 jacks for 1 piece of cable. So I have the price of my cable. But for PoE and for gigabit, you're going to want to have all the pairs, so you need to fix that. That, again, is a cable job. You're also going to look for your fiber. So you have fiber between your closets. Is it up to current spec? Is it OM3 multi-mode, or is it still OM1? If I can, I want to upgrade the OM1, because I'm now adding a lot of data. I'd like to give my core as much bandwidth into the core as I can. Even though I probably won't use much more than a gig if I'm lucky, still, if I've got that much overhead, when someone starts pointing fingers and saying, well, we just need to upgrade all the links between the closets, you're like, they're 20 gigs, they're running a 2% utilization, that's not it. I'm saying 20 gigs because, of course, Mr. Redundancy says we're going to do a port channel to a VSS, so we're going to have 20 gigs. The other thing you're going to want to look at is, when you're looking at the cabling, is that, do I have cabling running to multiple floors? Some of the requirements now for your enhanced 911, you have to not only give an address, but also a floor number or a suite if that's appropriate. So if my cabling runs hither and thither to multiple floors, well, if it's built that way because there's only one closet for these, well, I may need to go and segregate that, repatch all my ports. So I put all my first floor cabled on these blades, second floor cabling on those blades, and third floor cabling on yet another set of blades. Or if I have different switches, I got to make sure that I know where those boundaries are, so I can set the proper voice VLANs. Because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to use the IP range to tell call manager what's the address of that phone, where is it sitting. So that's some of the other things you're going to spy out as you do this. And is your wireless network sufficient for a VoIP deployment? So if it's really old, it's only running 802.11 G or B, you're going to want to go on to the A band because there's less channel contention because of the greater number of channels. And I'm going to need a higher density. So I can run a fairly low power signal while still keeping coverage so that the phones can roam. And one of the things you have to remember, the reason we keep the power down on that is that handheld can only generate so much power. Its antenna is only so big and it can only run so much power. If you can, sure, I can crank my APs up to max, but can they hear my phone coming back? So power is an issue. So addressing that is going to be important. And if you have problems with dropout scenarios, well, you're going to want to get that fixed if you're going to make the voice successful, because they're going to carry these phones like cell phones. They're going to expect them to act pretty much like cell phones, but better. Okay. I can talk about a sparing strategy because in this, we're talking about the foundations here. So this is planning. So if I want to have spares, and you think about this, how do I buy my contracts? There are two ways people go about this. One of them I don't even show on the slide is some people, they're buying equipment that's no longer supported by Cisco or whomever. They're going off eBay, they're getting it cheap, and their sparing strategy is I buy 150% of my need, or I buy 200% of my need, and I warehouse the other equipment. That isn't always workable, particularly something that requires licensing, because they don't always want to sell you licensing for dead gear anymore. So assuming you're buying contracts, okay, do you buy 2-hour contracts? Are they 4-hour contracts? Or you do 8x5 next business day, or you have some other strategy? You can always make 8x5 next business day work given a couple of requirements. So I have enough of the models that I can slip in some spares. So if I have like 13750 Gs, okay, what's 105 or 110? And I have these spares strategically located so that they're close to my sites. So when I have a breakage, that I can immediately go into my spare pool, put that one in place of the one that's broken while I wait for my RMA, which is not going to show up till the next business day, which, on a Friday, late enough on a Friday, and if it's a 3-day weekend with Monday as a holiday, it's going to be Wednesday before I see it. So that doesn't work well if I don't have spares, right? And this spare strategy doesn't have to be the same for all equipment categories. You think about access points. If you run enough, you have thousands of APs in the ceiling. By the time you pay even for 8x5 next business day support, you could have bought a huge number of APs in that same window as spares. And it's better just buy the spares. Do all your team members have the CCO accounts and have all the right contracts associated to their accounts? As you go into deployment, you don't want to be, hey, you're the on-call guy and they didn't give you half the contract, so you're trying to get something, you're trying to get support, you're trying to get help, and you don't have the right contract association and nobody's available to tell you what the right contract number and to approve adding that into your CCO account. So take care of those kind of details before you start the deployment. And to me, this is part of your sparing strategy because you're ready. Something breaks, the guy's ready to order that RMA. Okay. And you got to think about what spares you have now, and are they located so as to support your VoIP deployment? So you have to think about it. If all my spares are, well, I'm up in the San Francisco Bay Area. If all my spares are in LA, I got to overnight it. I can do air freight, and I can get to San Francisco, and it's going to be a few hours. It's going to be expensive. I'm going to need to drag somebody out of bed in LA to go get this on the plane. And then, I have to get myself out to the airport to meet it, and hopefully everything worked right. Probably better if I had spares that are within a reasonable driving distance. Now, if you're super dispersed, this can be a serious issue, and it's one of the things you're going to want to do in your planning. How am I going to deal with spares in that situation? You may look at some hybrid strategy where you keep some stuff with 2-hour contracts because it's less expensive to keep a 2-hour contract rather than having a spare in this tiny little site that's in the middle of nowhere, assuming you can get that 2-hour contract. They won't always sell them if you're too remote, because they're going to have trouble getting anything to you in 2 hours. So that's the thing to be. And then include the spares in your budget, purchase them as you're buying your equipment for the project. Now, I tend to run my spare pool on a first in, first out. So if I have a 3850 switch of the same design, same options as I'm using for this new incoming project, I'm going to pull that spare off the shelf, use that first, and then use one of the ones for the project to replace that spare. Just it keeps it's just sort of keeping things tidy. Okay, let's talk about standards. And this is an important thing in this early design phase, is do you have a standard build? Which I think should include your SNMP community strings, logging host, all that kind of important, real basic stuff. The reason I ask this question, and a standard build has to be written down. Now, admittedly, if you are small enough where you literally I have 4 switches if you have 4 switches in your entire office, you probably can get away with not writing it down, because there's just not going to be a lot here. You're not going to have 12 different monitoring tools. You're not going to have a lot of things. You probably can get away with not writing it down. Otherwise, you need to write it down. I've heard way too often well, how should I build this? Especially, in network, there's a dozen ways to do everything. So how should I build this? Oh, well, log into a good one, build it like that one. Well, how do I know a good one is? Well, this one's a good one. How do I know? Because you have a written standard, right? And you're going back and updating it constantly. So you bring up a new virtual machine with a new version of HP OpenView and transfer over the database from your old version. It's got a different IP. You're going back into your SNMP traps, changing the trap destinations. You're making sure that's all in your standard doc. Do you have physical design and cabling standards? Again, if you not get started, and the reason I say this is that you go and hire a cabling vendor, it's great if you can produce written standards, because they're all over the place. They really are. I can't tell you how many guys who do just really, really stupid stuff, like they're not supporting the cables, they've got stuff like running over ballasts and all kinds of things you're not supposed to do, but they do it, right? And they're like, oh, I'm a cabling guy. Sometimes it's your electrician, and I can do low voltage. The weirdest thing I ever saw was they needed to splice a cable. They were electricians. So they took wire nuts. This was phone, thankfully. They took wire nuts and did it because they didn't have anything to do a proper splice for even a voice cable. They just weren't used to it. So when you have physical standards, it also means too, you can be looking and seeing, yep, there's cable tray here. Here's the J hooks that are they're supporting the cable. They're not doing zip ties or doing Velcro to wrap the cables, so they don't get over tightened and damage the cables. There's a lot of things that's great when it's written down. It's harder for your vendor to argue. And you can include some things too. I work a lot with AT&T, and AT&T has very strict requirements on a lot of things when they're running fiber optic service in. When you're providing path, they've got every third 90 degrees, it needs a pole box. Here's the pole box size. It's a little large. Your electrician running your EMT is probably like, oh, it doesn't need to be that big. Yes, it does, because AT&T is not going to finish the job if it's not right. So including that kind of stuff is great to have. Have you designed your multicast infrastructure? So why I'm focusing on that, Informacast is great. You can do your paging and you could set up groups, and I'll use multicast, and multicast is a great application for multicast. If you haven't designed it, you haven't thought about how that's going to work, how you're going to divide up the private ranges in multicast, how you're going to do your IPs, or if you can do source specific, what are you going to do? You want to make sure you've done that, because multicast is one of those things that, look, you build your unicast infrastructure, you're used to it, you do it all the time. Multicast, you're not. Your unicast will be working fine, but you forgot to turn on multicast routing on a critical device. The unicast works fine because by default unicast is turned on. Multicast is not. So if you haven't thought about it, have your standards written out and are ready to go to rock with it, and to be able to audit to make sure it's right. that's where you're going to run into trouble where your Informacast is either not going to work or it's going to work inconsistently. So that's good to get up front. And as part of this series on VoIP, I'm going to do a whole series on multicast because I think it's that important. Have you designed your quality of service policies? Documented them and deployed it and tested. So there's a lot of subtlety to it if you're doing particularly shaping. So you want to think about queue depths. So when you start actually maxing on a circuit and they start queuing, maybe you've got your queue depth set too long. So now users are frustrated, particularly using something like Citrix. So the data of their mouse moving is being delayed, so they're going too far, so they're overshooting, and now they're frustrated because they clicked on the wrong thing and they're having to redo and they're really upset. So getting that all right and dialed in, it's really good to have that dialed in before you really start pushing your VoIP deployment. And do you have a list of standard software versions for your entire portfolio of devices? So Cisco released for 3850. I was a little surprised. Just had a new one on the bench. There was an internal official release. I put that on, and I start seeing. I'm on the console, and I see all these messages about PoE turned on, PoE turned off, PoE just kind of flashing up. There was one cable connected, and it wasn't talking about that one cable. So something in their MAC detector wasn't working properly. So it was triggering an alarm to say that PoE starting on this port. That wasn't actually happening. So having a list of standard software versions, hey, we take that off our standard list. We're going to go to a different one. You may encounter problems. I certainly did with the 3900 series routers, where some particular software versions were really unhappy with FXO, FXS, T1E1, and causing a lot of problems for the telecom side of this equation. And so, okay, what's a good solid version? And using that inventory, I'm going to go back to an inventory list, get to these standard versions, making sure they're standard and consistent. The other thing that does for me was certainly when I'm troubleshooting a problem, if I have the same equipment, same loads, same code, and I'm only having the problem at one, it's more likely that I have a problem with a piece of hardware. If I'm seeing it happen at more than one place, it's probably the code. And I may have to get more subtle. Maybe it's versions of the FXO modules, versions of the T1E1, or versions of the router itself. Sometimes there's a V2 that's stuck in there. So these are all good things to know why you want that standard list. So this is all work that can be done. Most of this can be done, all of this can be done without money. Developing your standards, physical cabling, all of that can be done. You don't have to spend any money on this. So they may not have even budgeted yet, not even released funds for your project. These are kind of things you can work on. You can create that inventory, do your walkthroughs, do your standards ahead of time. All right. Now I want to talk about a little bit more. So since each platform has its own bugs, its own uniqueness, and of course they're all you run across different time periods. Network equipment is typically expensive and will stay around for a long time. It can be 8 to 10 years that you may keep a piece of network equipment. Unlike a PC, which 10 years is just insane. But for network equipment, it can make sense. Hey, it's now finally, I bought it at the beginning of its life cycle. It is now, it's going to begin to support this year. I'll pull the thing out. It's been in 8, 9, 10 years. Okay. So you won't necessarily be running the exact same code across all the platforms. You won't. Think about how you validate the new code. Now, I like to do something like think very carefully. Do I have sites that are less critical? So since I do work in healthcare, I don't want to be testing code in things like emergency rooms, ICU, all those life or death kind of places, ORs, right? If I have a clinic that is, well, for example, things like physical therapy. Yeah, their network goes down. It's not life or death. Typically, a lot of that is not integrated. So your therapist is probably going to ask you some questions and kind of go back and do the exercise they had you do last time. So, or do has a particular therapy regimen that they're working through, so they may not even need to get into your record. They just need to do it to do billing. So if I can test there first, I also like places that are more tech savvy, if at all possible. If I have user sites that are a little more tech savvy, they may be able to say, I noticed this is different. If I have some that are very tech phobic, okay, let's not do those. They struggle enough around their technology, and then you throw in your new code and maybe some new issues with it. Don't do that. Right? So we want to think about this ahead of time if you haven't already done so. Do you have regulatory requirements, including things like payment card industry, PCI, you need to follow? So as you go to do all these things, hey, where is that going to pop up? It may be on things like updating software versions. You may be pushed to do certain software versions. So it's things to think about. Do you have security requirements you have to make? Certainly, if you're working in something with high security, hey, I need to bring that phone. The phone's VoIP. I want to bring the network in there, and you have secure and unsecured networks. You need to plan that ahead of time. How things are going to get across. How are you going to make that work? Now, in your standard software version deployment, is there any way you can do any kind of bench testing? And do you have any way of enhanced bench testing? So oftentimes bench testing, we can be kind of stuck. We throw our laptop on it, we do a few things, okay, it looks fine. Obviously, if you have better equipment that can do load simulation, traffic simulation, that's great, because then you may be able to see some of the problems. Again, as I said earlier, where are these sites where I can test new code? And pick a soak time. It could be a few days, could be a week, could be longer, could be 2 weeks. Right? I'm going to go to my pilot sites, let them soak for 2 weeks. Hopefully, certain things like memory leaks may not show up. You may be noticing a trend upwards for memory, but maybe that's not long enough. Some of these things you're not going to be able to avoid, but definitely pick some sort of soak time before you push it out across the world. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of pain, a lot of upset, and some long nights getting onto better code. So talked about earlier, create that list of known good versions, and use that with you when you're deploying your new equipment. And as you go to deploy, you may find whole new sets of bugs, because now you're asking to do different things. So here's a to-do list based on this segment. Okay, take a look at your standards that you have and figure out what you need to create before your deployment can begin. Your hardware list. Start putting that together. If you have a tool, your SolarWinds, HP Network Automation, whatever you have, can you get a dump out of that to start going through? And you're also looking at, you want to look at things like capacity. If this switch is already absolutely full, you got a chassis at 4510, okay. If I have no room for additional blades, and hey, I may have some wall phones, some traditional wall phones I need to get replaced with VoIP phones, I need more ports. You got to figure that out. Either you're going to be able to reclaim ports and make room that way, or maybe you have to figure out adding additional equipment. So this hardware list is what you're trying to get at. It's your order list. So do I need parts for redundancy? Do I need some additional supervisors to add to chassis? Do I have enough spares? The capacity adds I think I'll need, do I have those covered? So if I need to buy more blades, or even some, like a stackable to throw on top of a existing chassis, or adding into stacks, do I need those? Do I have stuff that's end of life? Probably best before I'm doing a big initiative like this to get my end of life stuff out of there, unless that's your whole strategy to begin with, is to run off end of life. So you're going to fold some of that stuff in here. Make a list. What rooms I got to clean up? What things what rooms need additional AC, power cabling? Track all that. So you make sure that stuff gets done and gets funded. Obviously, just cleaning the room, like getting stuff decommissioned, probably doesn't cost you money unless you're bringing in outside contractors. But upgrading your air conditioning, power, those all cost money. If I need to get cabling work done, it costs money, right? So that's all going to roll into that budget. You want to make sure that gets captured. You don't want to be in a position where they roll it. No, this is the budget for the project. It's done. You don't want that, and you've got serious cabling stuff to deal with, rooms that are already overheating, and they're going to put more gear in. You need to make sure that gets covered. Create a list of devices needing code upgrades. So that inventory sheet I talked about early on, make sure that gets done as part of the deployment. There's other things you're going to be doing too, like turning on quality of service. You can use Cisco's default policies, or you can come up with something of your own if that makes sense. But I need to go do that anyway before the phones get deployed. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to do the code upgrades. If there's other additional configuration, like fixing the monitoring host, the trap destinations, SNMP strings, all those kind of real fundamentals, let's get that done. Make sure that the devices are all in the proper monitoring tools. So I've got a good list going here. I've got changes to do. I've got budget to get. I've got equipment to buy and spec. And then think about this one, which is I mentioned the cabling going to different floors. Okay, do I need to? It's easier if I have a closet that supports multiple, let's call them E911 zones. It's easier to repatch so you make the cables contiguous. I can do a matrix that says one is on the first floor, port 2 is on the third floor. I can do that. I can. But it's easier if, and I've even developed a Visio diagram that I printed out and stuck in the closet that said these blades are basement, these blades are first floor. So to try and make it easy for people working in the closet to be able to patch things in the right place, so that phone shows up with the right enhanced 911 information. So if you need that, you got to get that tracked. That one you may be bringing in some contractors to help out with because it's pretty tedious work. You probably have to supervise it unless you're doing real pros, or you may have to do the prep work for it, even if you are using some pros. But make sure you have that list, and that may go into your funding request. And hopefully there's contingency money. So this is part one. This is the kind of get you started. There's a lot more to talk about. So next week we're going to dig into the next segment of this. And as we go along, I don't have the entire week to week mapped out. I'm kind of working this a week at a time. That certainly we're going to go forward and looking at quality of service in detail. We're going to look in multicast in detail. Those topics alone are going to take a couple of weeks to get through. So keep coming back. Hope you found this valuable. And again, thanks for watching. There's a link to my YouTube channel. You can follow me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter, and I have these announced on Twitter as well. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can find the presentation on SlideShare. If you have additional topics you want, or you have any comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I do go back and take a look at them. So again, thanks for tuning in. This is David Headley. Hope you enjoyed our Tech Talk Tuesday, and we will see you next week, I hope. Let's see. Thanks everybody for stopping in. There we go.